That's really cool. Well, I came back to work on Monday morning. I got my 40 hours in this week, and I'm thinking, like, who in the heck thought of this 40-hour work week thing? Like, I was in bed by like 7 o'clock on Friday. It's like, wow, that's a lot of work. And no, it's great to be back. I've missed y'all. Amber and Benjamin and David they missed y'all too. And we just got to see so many cool things. And I'll be sharing those things over the next decade, I'm sure. I finished writing a book. I finished at this little picnic table here. This is a picnic table at a park in Copenhagen, and I wrote a specific prayer for Benjamin and David, and that's the last prayer that will be in the book, The Prayers from the Water's Edge. There's 100 prayers and some pieces of prose and a few other writings in there. That will be out this fall, and I can't wait for y'all to read it. All the profits are going to go to the church, so pray it becomes a New York Times bestseller. Buy it for all your friends and give it to them for Christmas. And the other book I didn't quite finish. I got 40,000 of 60,000 words done, and you'll get to read that one next fall. So we're making progress on that one. Really want to just take a moment here to acknowledge, sometimes have you ever been really, really blessed before, and thank you doesn't just seem like enough, and that's kind of the way I feel. And I just want to start with the staff. A lot of them took on extra stuff, extra hours, extra energy, and they did that for me. So I'm just, let's give a hand of welcome and appreciation to our staff. Just judging on the video and everything else I've heard, you all just had a great summer. It was a large part because of their leadership. And I also want to thank you, the church, as well. When I applied for this grant a year and a half ago, I didn't know if I'd get the grant, and I didn't know what the reaction would be if I did get it, but y'all have just been nothing but supportive for that. So on behalf of the family, I just want to thank you for your support and your encouragement during the time of sabbatical. Now, I'm sure there's some new people over the last 3.5 months. You're probably wondering who I am. Well, my name's Craig Finnestad. I'm your pastor. Now you get the next 25 minutes to determine whether you want to continue that relationship or not. Actually, at the first service, it was really long. It's like 40 minutes, so that will give you 15 additional minutes. I'm not joking either. It's a long sermon. But no, I hope you stay with us because, and not because of me, because of this church. Now I know something about this church. It has something to give to you, whether it's a small group, whether it's a friendship, whether it's a place to serve, whether it's a place for your children to come and become disciples. I know that, and I also know that you have something to give to this church. You are uniquely you. You're wired in a unique way. You have gifts and skills and talents, and I want to tell you this. We need you. We need more prayers. We need more donors. We need more servants. We need more listeners. We need more servants. And I just can't wait to meet you. If you'd like to come up to me after church, I'd just love to shake your hand and get to know your name. So now it's time for us to build a church. Y'all ready for this? It's going to be cool stuff. We get to do something that no other church in Omaha is doing right now, and that's building a church from the ground up. We're going to take what used to be a farm, and it's going to be light to a dark world. It's going to be a place where the lonely can come and be embraced. It's going to be where hurting people can come and experience healing. It's a place where friendships will be formed. It's a place where families will be strengthened. It's a place where life's most sacred moments will happen. It's 23 acres set apart for God and God's purposes. So this morning and the next 2 Sundays, I'm going to be taking a look at just a few of the things I learned during our time away. So next week, you get to hear about my experience as a comedian at the Gotham Comedy Club in New York City. This was tough work. It was, seriously. And I worked Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in New York with a coach and went to classes and got it reviewed from other comedians. And when I got to the stage, I was so nervous. It's like I get up there and I'm like, hey, I'm a pastor. They laughed at that. It wasn't even a joke. I was just introducing myself. And I'm funny even when I don't try. And I said, yeah, I got a friend that's an atheist. And she asked me one day, does it bother you that I'm an atheist? And I said, it doesn't bother me. I'm not the one going to hell. And Then I was like, I got this friend that's an anesthesiologist, and he came up to me after church one day, and he said, hey, Craig, I figured it out. What we both got in common, we get paid money for putting people to sleep. And I'll leave out the 8 minutes where I just swore and cussed, and my act was totally clean. So the week after that, I'm going to talk about it's Labor Day weekend, which is also the kickoff to a football season. Can I get an amen? All right, and you clap for the football. You don't clap for building a church. We got to get our priorities straight. We have to work on y'all. No, we're going to talk about, ironically, we're going to talk about our time at a lake. And Labor Day, ironically, is like a really busy weekend for some people, and it's not supposed to be that way. Like, I got this figured out. If God says that we should rest, and the government says that we should rest, and God and the government actually agree on something, we should probably listen. So that day we're going to talk, if you're stressed out, if you're busy, if you're maxed out, that's what we're going to talk about on Labor Day. Now, 3 weeks from today, we're going to have our lot party. This is always one of the biggest weekends of the year for us. It'll be out on our church property. Invite your friends, invite your family, invite your neighbors. Also, if you have not been baptized before, or if you don't know if you've been baptized, write baptism on your sheet if you feel led to be baptized. I would love to share in that moment with you. If you do that, I'll give you a call this week, and we'll talk about what it means. And it's always really one of the highlights of the church year for us to have the baptisms in the big tank out there. And it's just it's a powerful experience. I invite you to participate in that. So we went to Europe. That was our first stop. The boys got out of school on May 24th, early afternoon, and 7 o'clock that night we were on a plane to London. And what was really interesting about Europe, I think we visited 13 different countries, and we heard something in every single country, no exceptions. One of the things we heard, the thing that we heard that went through the whole continent was 70 years ago, there's a war. And this is still part of their story. Benjamin and I, you can show the picture up here. We were in London, and he and I that morning went to Churchill's war room. So this is where Winston Churchill and dozens of his leaders camped out underground during World War II. This is right between Westminster Abbey and where the Prime Minister lives, kind of by Big Ben and all that area. And it's way underground, and it's got this great, you can see it, like this great big thing of cement protecting it from the German bombs. We heard that a lot in the UK. We were in Paris, we heard it there. We went to Brussels and Amsterdam and Copenhagen. We heard about it there. When we were in Oslo, it started to rain really heavily, and we were just happening by this Norwegian Resistance Museum. So we went inside the Norwegian Resistance Museum to stay dry. And one of the things we learned there, this was a country that was occupied by Germany from 1941 to 1944, and we learned about these brave Norwegian men, women, and children that did everything they could do to fight the Nazis. The Germans, the Norwegians, the British people, they know something that all of us know. Sometimes life is not easy. They got a glimpse of this 70 years ago. They get a glimpse of it today. We get a glimpse of it today. We've been there. Some of us are there right now. Some of us we all will be there in the future. All sorts of enemies, they attack us and occupy us. Some of us have addictions and diseases that we deal with. Those are our enemies. Some of us are our own worst enemy. We have self-destructive behaviors. We make bad choices, and we pay the consequences from that. People hurt you sometimes. They hurt us for various reasons, and none of those reasons are good. Accidents happen, and sometimes life just is not fair. Now, there's a guy in the Bible that went through one of those moments. There's a guy in the Bible who really messed up. His name was John Mark. Now, John Mark is introduced to us in the book of Acts, chapter 12. The Bible doesn't say a lot about John Mark, but it says enough to figure out what was going on. Now, we read about him in Acts chapter 12. Peter had just escaped from prison. So Peter was actually sleeping late one night. And an angel came and basically busted Peter out of the prison. He set him free. Now, Peter was running around the streets of the city, and this is where the story picks up. Peter was thinking it was a dream, but when he got to this place, he realized it was no dream. So in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, when he, so this is Peter, realized this, it wasn't a dream, but he had been set free from prison, he went home, or he went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where many were gathered in prayer. So this right there tells us a little bit about John Mark. We know that his mom's name was Mary, which means that he actually would have known Jesus. You know, he would have seen some of the things that happened. He certainly would have heard the stories, and he knew the 12 as well. Yeah, so John Mark, he was connected. He knew some people. Now, this was a few years after the death of Jesus. The story continues in Acts chapter 12, verse 25. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission to Jerusalem, they returned, taking John Mark with them. So John Mark knew somebody else. He not only knew Jesus and the 12, he knew Paul as well. Yeah, so John Mark, he knew people. Now in the next chapter, Barnabas and Saul, or Paul as we later know him, they were sent on a mission to Cyprus. Now Cyprus is an island. It's due south of Turkey, and it's to the west of what's modern-day Syria. Now, they were sent to plant churches on this long, skinny island, and the Bible says that John Mark went with them. You know, John Mark was their assistant. Now, this is where we come in, okay? Has anybody ever let anybody down before? So I think we all have, right? And that just, if you did it intentionally, if you did it unintentionally, like, it doesn't feel good either way. Now, John Mark knew what it meant to let somebody down. We read about what happened in Acts chapter 13, verse 13. Paul and his companion then left Paphos by ship for Pamphylia, landing in the town of Perga. There, John Mark left them, and he returned home to Jerusalem. So Barnabas and Paul were counting on John Mark. They went to this island to plant a bunch of churches and to spread the gospel. And it was all hands on deck. Church planting back then, and it is today, it's tough work. So instead of all hands on deck, John Mark found another boat. He found the boat back to Jerusalem where his mom lived. It was an area he was familiar with. It was an area that was safe. He didn't have to depend on people's generosity. There was no risk involved for him. But he left those guys hanging out there. And Paul and Barnabas, they stuck with it. They sailed and they walked all over the place planting churches. And these were the two men who were the pioneers of the early church. Now, John Mark's story continues in Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36. After some time, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached the word of the Lord to see how the new believers are doing." So they planted these churches. They wanted to go check them out. Barnabas agreed, and he wanted to take along John Mark. But Paul disagreed strongly, since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. Now, the disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas as he left. The believers entrusted him to the Lord's gracious care as he traveled throughout Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches there. So just in this one little passage, we learn a couple really important things about John Mark, and we're also going to learn a couple important things about us. Now, when John Mark left Paul and Barnabas, there was consequences to that. Now, when we let someone down, there's going to be consequences to letting them down. Paul, he probably forgave him. Paul understood forgiveness. But Paul was not up for giving him a second chance. And giving someone a second chance and forgiveness aren't necessarily the same thing. Paul was like, there's too much at stake here. We've got to get back to this island. We've got to check on these churches. We only have so much room in this ship, and I'm not going to give a space to this guy who's already let us down once. Now, Barnabas, he wasn't happy with that. He wasn't happy with that at all. And, John Mark, he caused this distance between these two brothers. so much that they split up and went their separate ways. So now John Mark, he deals with the shame, the internal shame that we have when we let somebody down. And he's also dealing with the guilt that he broke up a perfectly good friendship that was almost like a brotherhood. Now, we learned something else about John Mark as well, and we're going to learn something else about ourselves. John Mark didn't continue to live in his mom's basement. John Mark said, okay, Paul's not going to give me a second chance, but Barnabas is. And I'm going to take Barnabas up on that chance, and I'm going to go to this place where I left these people hung out to dry. And one prayer, one person, one word, one act of kindness at a time, John Mark put his life back together. And that's how it happens with us. One person, one prayer, one step at a time. Now, the people of Berlin, Germany, they know something about one step at a time. We got to spend a day in the city, and this city was absolutely destroyed at the end of World War II. There was 363 Allied air raids over the course of 4 years that devastated and pound this city into oblivion. At the end, there was this ruthless battle against Russia in what we know today as the Battle of Berlin. 40% of the city was ruined. The buildings were destroyed. They started to tear them down, and they started to build it back up. And 70 years later, Berlin is an absolutely gorgeous city. It's a fairly modern city. They got these tall trees that line these busy boulevards, and you have to look really hard to find any evidence or any proof of what happened 70 years ago. Well, there was this really important building that's in Berlin. It's the Wilhelm Kaiser Memorial Church. At the time, it was the tallest building in Berlin. In 1943, the British Royal Air Force was doing a counterattack on Germany. And one of their bombers virtually destroyed what you see is left of this church. This church is not the tallest building anymore. It's certainly not the prettiest building anymore. And the architect that they assigned to this church, because this church is a city landmark, it was a city landmark. It had been there for generations, and they wanted to build something that would be there for generations. And the architect, he's like, okay, I can't do it. We are not going to tear this church down. Because on this busy boulevard, when people walk by this church, they need to be reminded of the horrors and the devastation and the death that war is all about. We need to remember what happened. So what they've done is they've built this very modest church. It seats 1,000 people. It's not more than like 3 stories tall right next to it. It kind of looks like a commercial office building that they don't want people to know is actually there. But people, it's like there's this huge shopping mall across the street from like this ruined church. And every time that somebody drives by there, every time that somebody walks by there, they look at that church and they remember where they have been. Now, John Mark, he had a ruined church in his life. In fact, he had a couple of them. Every time that Barnabas had to tell him what happened in Cyprus his first time around, John Mark had to realize that there was a missed opportunity because he could have been there and he could have helped them. I think every time John Mark heard Paul's name, I think John Mark, he had to feel some guilt about that. So there's another ruined church for John Mark. In fact, John Mark's ruined churches, they have these names. They have this name of shame, and they have this name of guilt. He let somebody down, and he caused a relationship between 2 friends to end. Now, I have a ruined church in my life. I got a few of them. And I'm guessing that everybody in this room has their own version of a ruined church. The person who beat cancer, but their body isn't quite the same as it was at one time. You know all about a ruined church. The family or the friendship that has gone through a painful separation or ending. You drive by a house where you used to live, or a restaurant where you used to meet, and you see a ruined church. The person who has lost their job, they see their old friends hanging out on Facebook, and they're not looking at an Instagram post, they're looking at a ruined church. The person who has made bad choices that has led to a lot of debt, they get a credit card bill. And what that credit card bill actually is a ruined church. Now, I want you to know this, a ruined church is not a bad thing. I think that church is one of the most important landmarks in Berlin because it helps them and it helps us remember what once was. Many of these people are going to look at this and they say, we have come so far. In 7 decades, we have rebuilt this city. We can look at our ruined churches and we can see the progress that we have made. We can see where we once were. We carry scars from our past, and that's okay. Because we can be wounded healers. We can be people who are recovering. In these ruined churches, they will remind us how far we've come. Now I'm going to tell you a story of another church. This one is in St. Petersburg, Russia. So getting through the security gate in Russia, that was a really interesting experience, especially if you're an aspiring comedian. So you get there and the KGB is waiting for you. They looked at my passport and they looked at mine and looked at me and I said, I know, I put on some weight since the picture, it just happens, and she says, why are you here? Or she said, who do you work for? Or what do you do? Who do you work for? And why are you here? I said, okay, this woman needs some joy in her life, so I'm going to just help her out here. I said, I'm a computer hacker. I work for Donald Trump, and I'm here to do some recon work. So then they put me in this little room with all these bright lights, and if you believe this story, don't, because it's not true. But they were pretty stringent. They said, I told them I was a pastor, I work at a church, I'm here to see their beautiful city. It's kind of like ordering soup from the soup Nazi, if you know, Seinfeld stuff, and they let me in. Someone once told me that St. Petersburg is a beautiful city, perhaps the most beautiful city in the world, and after being there, I can't disagree with them. This is just, it's eye candy everywhere. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now, St. Petersburg, from 1941 to 1944, was also the home to the most deadly battle in human history. So if you take the 1.8 million people who live in Nebraska, the 3.1 million people who live in Iowa, and you add them up, you have 4.9 million people. The Battle of St. Petersburg, 5.1 million lives were lost. These people know about devastation. These people know about destruction. Now, we saw some cool buildings. We worshipped at Westminster Abbey in London. We took communion there. I tried to find a bathroom for David there, my son. That's a whole sermon series of how that played out, and you'll hear that sometime. We went to the Cathedral of Notre Dame in France. I got to go to the Domkirche in Stavanger, where my grandpa would have went as a child. The church means cathedral in Norwegian, and the church is 1,000 years old. So we saw dozens of churches, but I've never seen anything like this, never will again. It's the Church of the Spilled Blood. So this was completed in 1907. It took 25 years to build. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this church is there's no paint on the interior, there's no plaster, there's no wood. This church on the interior is comprised of over 1 million tiles. Some artists will use canvas, some will use clay, some will use metal. These people use mosaic tiles. I could have stayed there for weeks and just looked at all the different, one day you just get a glimpse of them. This is beyond beautiful. Now, the Germans, they did a good job of destroying this church. After the war was over, and the Germans had to retreat back to Germany in 1944, they used this as a morgue, and after they got the bodies cleared out, they used this to store potatoes for the people who were fighting famine. Now, the Soviet Union, they're not interested in rebuilding a church. So it just sat there in ruins until 1970, when some committed people said, we want to rebuild. We're not asking for government money. We just want to rebuild this thing as a tribute to our parents and our grandparents. So as it took 25 years to build the thing, it took them 27 years to restore the place. Now, you know how they did this? This is people coming in at nights, weekends, using up vacation time, craftsmen, artists. You know how they did this? They did this one tile at a time, over 1 million times. Now, you go to this place, and it's the most amazing place you'll ever see. Now, John Mark, he knows what it's like to put his life together one tile at a time. God gave him a second chance, and he walked alongside of Barnabas on this island of Cyprus. And one person, one prayer, one word, one act of kindness at a time, John Mark put his life back together. Now, that's the way it's going to work with us as well. There's no easy fix to the problems that have been created, whether we've created them or someone else has created them or they just happen to happen. The way that we do this is I'll tell you this, if these committed Russians could put this masterpiece back together after 27 years, there is no telling what God can do with his masterpieces when we're faithful to his grace. Now, I'm going to tell you about one more city. I knew the story I knew about this church. I'd read about it. It was so I saw this church, and I think I probably saw it differently than some of the tourists did. What I saw was I saw the rebuilding. I thought about the nights. I thought about the weekends. I thought about climbing up on ladders. I thought about the artist looking at old pictures and just trying to piece these little tiles together. I thought about the men and women who went up there and did all the what I saw was perseverance. What I saw is that somebody's mess had now become this powerful message of what God can do through a bunch of committed people. Now, the Northern European countries, so here we're talking like Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands. These countries couldn't even put up a fight against Germany. In the Netherlands, where I'm going to talk about, the war lasted 2 hours, and the Dutch people just had to surrender. The Germans came in and they occupied the city. If you were a homosexual, if you're a Jewish person, your chances of survival were, slim to none. We went to a church, and I actually stood in line by this church for almost 2.5 hours on a very warm day. And we and thousands of other people were waiting just to walk through this little house. Now, you're going to see this little house up on the screen. So there it is. It's the one in color. And there's a little Jewish girl who lived in this house. She, as a child, got to play in this beautiful city with all these canals and all these green spaces and all these parks. But then when the Nazis came, they made it abundantly clear if you're Jewish, you're going to be placed in a resettlement camp, and your chances of living weren't that great. So her and her whole family went into hiding. Now, the woman's name, many of you probably know who I'm talking about, is Anne Frank. She would have been a teenager when she was in hiding in the back of this little house. As I walked through the skinny hallways, as I climbed the narrow stairs, as I walked through her room, looking at the desk that she would have written her journal, it was like this amazing experience. I remember the words that she wrote. With her life on the line, this little girl, what she wrote is, how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to change the world. I thought about the girl that wrote, think of all the beauty still left around you and be happy. I thought, I'm never going to complain another day in my life after visiting this place. She says, I don't want to have lived in vain like many people. I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. Now, this was a very devastating time for this girl and her family. They were in hiding. But here, her mess became a message. In fact, it became one of the most powerful pieces of literature that's ever been written. They eventually found that the Frank family was living there. They separated them. They hauled them off to concentration camps where a year or two later, Anne Frank's life would end as a teenage girl. Her dad found the diary. He read it. He was inspired. The publisher read it. He was inspired. And today, it's one of the best, still today, 70 years later, it's one of the best-selling books in human history. Now, after Paul's death, somewhere between the year 65 and the year 70, and then after the destruction of Jerusalem, just a few years after Paul's death, the Christians they had to spread all over the Middle East because they knew they weren't safe. Now, some of the leaders of the church, they knew that there had to be some sort of account of Jesus' record that would be written, or the church would just go in separate directions and it would end. And they knew that they had to find someone to write this gospel. And the someone they chose is the same person who deserted Paul and Barnabas that day in Cyprus. His name was John Mark. We simply today know him as Mark. Mark wrote the book that has been read by more people in the course of human history than any other book and any other person. There was a day that there was a doctor named Luke that used Mark's gospel to write his own gospel. There was a day a tax collector named Matthew used Mark's gospel to write the gospel of Matthew. And John did the same thing. Now, John Mark, he took his mess and he made it a message. I mean, who better to write a book about grace and forgiveness than someone who's experienced it? So what we get to do, just like Anne Frank did, and just like John Mark did, is we get to write our own gospel. You got the scars to prove it. You got the mess that can be a message. You're not too young. Anne Frank was a teenager. You're not too old. John Mark was well on Social Security at this time. Now, your gospel probably isn't going to be a book, which is just as well because we believe that actions are actually more powerful than words, don't we? You see, we live in this age of distraction. We live in this age of vanity. We live in this age of greed, and we live in this isolation. And what the world needs more than anything else and everything else is for us to go out into the world and write a bunch of gospels. And I believe that your gospel will probably have something to do with the word humility. So we live in this age of vanity, like we live in this age of selfie sticks and photo filters and image management. And if we look at Jesus, it's a gospel of humility. Today, what we need is people who are more willing to listen than to speak. Today, what we need is people who are less defensive and more understanding. Men and women who will be kind and gentle when provoked. Today, what we need is people who will get down on our knees and pray for our loved ones and pray for the world. Today, what we need are servants who are willing to sacrifice for the needs of others, even and especially when nobody else is looking. Today, what we need is people who will value patience over instant gratification. Today, what we need is people who are quick to practice forgiveness. Today, what we need is a bunch of gospels written in the language of humility that is spoken to our society and culture of vanity. Now, the next thing is I believe that your gospel will probably have something to do with generosity. Now, I'm not saying this to raise money. That happens next week. I'm just kidding. I say this because we live in a complex world of acquiring and consuming, and we are paying a high price because of things like envy and comparison and stress. We fill our schedules up and give some of our best time and energy to acquire and consume stuff that we don't need or want to impress people that we don't like. No, we got this wrong. Like Anne Frank said, no one has ever become poor by giving. You know, she's probably like 15 when she wrote this, and she had it figured out, and we can figure this out as well. You don't have to be rich to be generous. You have to be generous to be generous. Now, the last thing is I believe that your gospel will have something to do with being part of a church community. And I want you to hear this. I actually believe that you can be a Christian on your own. You don't need a church to be a Christian. You know, there's a lot of things you can do by yourself. You can play soccer by yourself. That would be a lot of fun, wouldn't it? You know, what the church does is it makes us better. It does. Being part of a biblically functioning church will enrich your life, and you will enrich the lives of others. The meaning and the grace that we get to discover is the grace that we get to share. As a participant in the kingdom of heaven, we will never have to face the world alone again. Now, here's an example of how this works here at the water's edge. So I want to challenge us to write our own gospel this week. To take a look at some of those ruined churches that exist in your life and realize how far you have come and realize that you can do this again. The way that you'll write this is just one tile at a time. That's the only way you can write this. And take this mess and make it your message. Some of the words that Mark would have written, and he would have been the first person to ever write these words, talked about the last night that Jesus was with his disciples. So Mark wrote something like this: when the meal's beginning, Jesus took the bread, he blessed it, he gave thanks, and he broke the bread and said, "This is my body that is given for you. When you eat this, do so in remembrance of me." And as you take the bread this morning, I want you to remember the humility, the generosity of Jesus. Those two words describe who he was. And later in the meal, Mark writes that Jesus took the wine, he gave thanks, he blessed it, and said, "Friends, this is my blood. It's the blood of the new covenant that has been poured out for you and the forgiveness of your sins. When you drink this, do so in remembrance of me." And I want us to remember the humility and the generosity of Jesus on a cross. He gave his life for our forgiveness. And I want us just to think how powerful that is if we've come to this place this morning and there's some stuff that's weighing us down. Because of the humility and the generosity of Christ, you are forgiven. In his name, you are forgiven. So let us pray.